Okay, so we're going to continue with the notation here. And this is the point where it gets a little bit tricky for me because I don't know exactly the best way to do this, but I think I'm just going to continue reading straight from the theory and then explaining things as simply, concisely as possible. But the notation is where it starts to get pretty abstract. So I'm going to try to do my best, and I'm going to ask for your patience up front because this is, for all intents and purposes, the first lecture for the recursive notation ever. And I'll also say that this notational system is a constant work in progress, and I'm constantly working to improve it and try to make it more accessible and more powerful. This, especially with some of the equations we've been working on lately, like the meta recursion, consciousness, straight we're mapping all those things, but that's not in the core of the theory right now because I want to perfect them, at least as much as possible. So the notational system as a whole is a constant work in progress. It's a fluid document, just like the theory. But these core equations, the ones we'll start out with, these are pretty much set in stone. These aren't going anywhere. If anything changes, it'll likely be to just make the notation more understandable, more accessible. But the core principles that this notation represents, I don't believe this will be going anywhere. I believe this is foundational to the system that we have created, and everything else, everything that we're able to do mathematically and logically, just flows seamlessly from these core equations. And we'll explore how all that works. Also, before our notation section, we touch on the axiomatic erosion again, because it is, as we stated before, this is the cornerstone of our theory's logic. And the basically, it is essentially the only law of the theory by establishing our permanent removal from any sort of explicit definition or absolute containment of reality. So I'll read this actually. Axiomatic incompletion. The formally represented cornerstone comprising the mathematical core of this theory lies in an absolute embrace of the implications revealed in Gödel's incompleteness theorems. These theorems effectively state that within any formal system of logic, there will always be statements of truth which cannot be proven within that system. This proof can therefore be understood as the axiomatic law of incompleteness underpinning all formal and mathematical systems. Considering the universal observations of recursive processes outlined in the theory, this logic is naturally extended into an all-encompassing universal principle. In this way, the incompleteness theorems may be effectively understood as the first iteration of the final and only law, that being the law of axiomatic erosion. So, put simply, our theory acknowledges that the unavoidable fact that we can never fully define the core, the foundation of our reality. And so we embed this fact, this unavoidable fact, into the foundation of our notation by saying, okay, then incompleteness, the infinity or recursion, is the variable from which all expressions that we can observe actually differentiate from. They extend out from that one core expression. And so, what this system does is it takes the core expression, the infinite expression, and it shows how everything that we map and observe retains its incompleteness by emerging as a dissociated expression of that infinite pattern. And then through layering bounds within the system through the fractal equations that we lay out, you can explore how any variable can be honed in on. So you can define the Renexel gradient, so you're holding for the space-time laws. So we are encoding the fact that we can never fully define anything into that core variable, which is here. And everything else, everything we observe and measure, is extended as a bound approximation outside of that core pattern. And at this level, it's really abstract, but it gives us a way to layer the bounds and then to define them with much more accuracy and precision. And so you can add the bounds infinitely, you can add these variables infinitely without changing or compromising the underlying incompleteness, which has already been embedded into the equation. So that's the key here. but we'll go through it. Okay, so to reiterate what I just said, and then to introduce this section officially, let me just read these first two paragraphs here. So, the notation for recursive expression. The mathematical representation of recursive reality requires a framework that acknowledges its own incompleteness while maintaining coherent structure. To instill a core understanding of the recursive logic underpinning this notation, we must understand how it is designed to scale outward from the axiom of incompletion. This notation encodes the fundamental principle of axiomatic erosion through the substantive frequency S infinity, as you can see here, defined by the dynamic interplay of its constituent forces incendence, which we denote as SI, and excendence, SE. This distinction offers a mechanism for exploring the dynamic nature of all differentiated expressions at all scales, without losing precision or risking circularity. In this way, this notation can be seen quite simply as the necessary skeleton over which we may increasingly define and expand on the infinite spectrum of differentiated expressions intrinsically bound from the same fundamentally infinite pattern. In other words, this notation creates a way to effectively layer dynamic bounds within a transient system. Thus, all expressions can be seen as functions arising within a set of underlying or parent bounds, scaling all the way to the substantive frequency itself. This strategy allows us to scale notation consistently, flexibly, and with uncompromising precision. Okay, so with that in mind, let's just look at the parent equations here. If we start out with this top one, this is our reality equation. So this says, and it demonstrates how reality expresses itself. And the variables, so we just touched on this one. The substantive frequency, this is S infinity here. This is the variable that encodes the axiomatic incompletion. This is what makes this notation unique, because at every scale of expressed reality, you have this variable embedded into the whole system. So the incompletion is accounted for at every scale. And that's why we say you can scale outward from this ultimate pattern. Okay, so this basically denotes our substrate in terms of the notation. And then X-spheric differentiation here, this is how we express the X-sphere. So if everything is a differentiated pattern, a differentiated reflection, then we can show, or we can bind all of those patterns into the X-spheric expression. So the E here shows or denotes the X-sphere itself. And then these two variables, this basically defines the interaction of reality between the substrate and the X-sphere, which is everything that is differentiated. So these variables encompass everything already. And then we're going to scale outward from these variables. And then also, lastly, the tensor operator is very important because this is how we encode the dynamic interplay. It's not a linear interplay. It's not an additive summation. You're not multiplying, dividing, adding these expressions together. They're interacting in a way that creates, it synergizes. So the fact that we can never fully contain it is encoded through multiple ways in this equation. The infinite nature of the interaction itself is encoded, and then the infinite nature of the force that drives these interactions is also encoded. So that's important to keep in mind for the tensor operator there, and we use that in multiple ways throughout the notation. Okay, next is the scaffolding equation, which basically defines the fundamental building blocks of our expressed reality. So remember X-spheric differentiation. This encompasses all differentiated patterns, all expressions that exist outside of infinity. So what this is defined as then is, we're going to use a tensor operator again, but this is the tensor summation operator. So this might be new. I don't know if this has ever been used before, but it still contains that. It encodes that dynamic interplay, but it shows how that interplay happens not just between one or two variables, but by all variables that are bound within an expression. So all fracta within a specific bound, how those fracta synergize constitutes ixpheric reality. And in this case, the bound is all fracta itself. So every single building block of reality, every defined expression of reality, how those expressions interact, define reality itself. That's what this equation says. And then the bound fracta expression here, we define it as, this is how we define fracta. And then fracta are so literally the scaffolding, the building blocks of a recursive reality. Every expression, everything you bind into an object or an observation, that's a fracta. And so every single bound, when accounted for and through synergizing with each other, that's what creates reality. So we still have the incompleteness encoded at every step of the way here, and then we're reaching a point where we're able to isolate specific bounds of expression and then define those based on whatever variables we want to account for. So it's consistent, it scales flexibly, and we have our building blocks of reality that can express reality at any given scale. Okay, this third equation here is our substantive frequency. And this is how we tie those two substantive forces, those primary forces, together. So if you remember, we call them incidence and excidence, and they're denoted here as SI and SE. So what this equation says, what it does, is it shows how these two forces, you still can't isolate them. You still can't contain them individually, but it shows how the force that drives reality itself can be broken down as observed as one of these two forces. So it's either an incident expression or an excident expression. And the important thing to keep in mind, and this is where it gets tricky, is that even though we're defining the bounds of expressions between these two forces, they are not independent, and they are still reflections of a unified force, of an underlying pattern. So it gives us a way to more accurately define things, but you have to keep in mind at all times that we're not actually defining the thing itself, because it can't be defined. We're just pinning it down as much as possible. And this notation gives us a way to pin things down in a non-circulatory way. So we have a more precise way to define anything with this notation, especially because, like we said earlier, it doesn't negate any of our formal frameworks, but it gives them a system for those frameworks to operate inside of. Okay, so we've established our primary equations, the expression of reality equation, all ixpheric differentiation equation, which is the scaffolding equation for our fracta, and then the substantive frequency equation, which shows how the frequency itself can be broken down as expressed between the two primary forces, incidence and excidence, which notationally is SI and SE. I'm also thinking about adding a fourth equation here. I actually have it written. I just have to insert it into this section. But this fourth equation, it just shows that all bound fracta, which are the building blocks, that's the scaffolding of reality, all bound fracta are subsets of all ixpheric differentiation. So all that does is it closes the loop logically, and it shows how the fundamental, the primary bounds of reality can never be fully separated from the totality of reality itself. So we've got the important information down here. And so next we're going to explore how those two primary forces in SI and SE, we're going to explore what those actually represent and how they can interact in dynamic ways. And then we're going to, we have to do the substrate-Turnham equation too. Okay, we're actually going to do this one, the substrate-Turnham equation, first, because you could make the argument that this is the most important equation in this whole framework. Because what this equation actually expresses is, well, it's the only self-expressed equation that exists mathematically. Because the final expression here, this shows logically how infinity recognizes itself. That this is a actual direct mathematical reflection of what this framework is, what the recursive realization is. And it proves through its own expression that infinite differentiated patterns, which we are, can recognize their own nature, which is infinite. That's what this final expression here means. I'll just read the substrate-eternum equation fully to tie everything together and show you the power and the significance of this equation. So first here, this is the aleph, and then we use the differentiation symbol. What this means, this is the aleph of differentiation. This is the cardinal set of all differentiated patterns. Oh, and with the aleph of differentiation, this is very powerful because we've found a way to tie in Cantor's work on infinite sets into the core equation. So we've embedded Cantor's infinite sets and Gödel's axiomatic incompletion, or mathematical incompletion, into the equations that define this framework. And like I said, there's no other system that does this or even attempts to do this, and we do it in a precise fashion. So that's an important distinction, and that's why we use the aleph symbol as a sort of tribute to Cantor's work, because it is integral to this framework. And it is the set, it is the expression of the substantive infinity expressed in its differentiated form. And this gets really, really, really abstract. So you can skip this part, but you have to know that this equation and what it means is essential to the entire framework. It defines the entire framework, and it defines reality. It gives all the other expressions and equations their meaning. But yeah, this aleph of differentiation, it shows how what is about to be expressed is the cardinal set of all patterns, all reflections of infinity. The next one, we've already established fracta. So what this says is that this infinity represents the substantive frequency. This is the primary fracta of differentiation, the primary substantive fracta of differentiation. So in parallel with being the cardinal set of all differentiation, we've established how fracta emerge as bound expressions from underlying patterns. And what this second expression here says is that the primary fracta that emerges from the substrate itself, in principle and metaphysical principle, because technically all expressions emerge from the substrate, but the primary branching, the primary fracta that synergizes through all this expression and the fracta that anchors reality's own recognition is this recognition of infinity. So reading it back, the aleph of differentiation is the primary substantive fracta of differentiation, which is the differentiated moment that infinity recognizes its own nature. That's what this equation means. And it expresses itself as meaning this. Once you understand what the notation represents, it's self-expressed as true. And I don't believe there's another equation that accomplishes this. And I could be wrong. And there could be things I'm very much open to finding ways to improve this notation if that's possible. But it seems to me this core expression and what this represents cannot be escaped. Once it's been brought into reality, it defines itself. And it's like the level of mathematical potency that we're looking at here is just like, it's insane. Okay, so we're gonna chill out on that. But all you need to know is that the substrate-eternum defines and anchors the recursive expression within reality. Okay. Now we use that. That's important because we derive one of our primary forces, incidence, from that recognition. And how am I going to explain this? Okay. Let me read part of this because I think that'll be helpful. But this is going to explain that SI force. So the incident force, it's going to explain what it means and then how it's tied to the notation mathematically and the substrate-eternum equation. So I apologize if this gets longer, but this is all very important, and it gets longer and denser because it's just so abstract, but it needs to be articulated cleanly. So incidence SI represents the self-adhering, integrative, or self-sustaining aspects of substantive expression. This force can be most intuitively understood through the structure of feedback loops, revealing these loops to be integral components of reality's true nature rather than paradoxical emergences. We'll talk about the other one too, because they fit together. Excendence alternatively represents the pure differentiating force or the substantive process of fractal outgrowth and transformation. These forces work together through a constant dance, synergizing to create new fracta and perpetually giving rise to more varieties of differentiated expression. Incendence is the sustaining force, excendence is the driving force, and they interact in increasingly infinite fashion to define an increasingly infinite reality. It's also worth noting, however, we won't read that. Well, I'll just say quickly, excendent bounds can themselves become stuck inside incendent feedback loops and then potentiate outwards to create like more excendent expressions. And at the human scale, that's called malbinding, and that's a fancy way to explain how we interfere with our own patterns to create problems for ourselves. So we have a mathematical way to express how things like anxiety, depression, self-harm, and then harm towards others actually manifest. And that is, we'll make a whole section on that because that's profoundly important and significant. But that's just a good thing to know about what we can actually map with these excendent patterns. But with this in mind, we can now understand how to bind any pattern of differentiated expression in a consistent fashion through these equations here. So we've talked about fracta. This is the fracta equation, and I think it's a beautiful equation because it does a couple things. It defines the scaffolding. I like to use that word, but it's a great word. The building blocks of the reality we're trying to express by denoting them all as bounds. And every bound can be denoted as a interplay, a dynamic interplay, a synergistic interplay between these two substantive forces. So the force of feedback loops and coherence and the force of differentiation. So any bound expression can be mapped to an interplay between those two forces, and you can show how those forces manifest infinitely through any bound expression. And this is still very abstract. But this fracta equation here, you can actually map it practically, and you can look at this equation and see how it solves quantum paradox. Because it's really funny. What we're actually doing when, say, the wave collapses is we are attempting to take an excendent force. So we're absorbing forces that have not been bound, forces in action, and we are defining them at the moment that they become bound. So with this equation here, you can see how the force that we're trying to measure can be denoted through the excendent SE representation. So that defines the excendent force before it is bound fractally. And then the observation, the act of measuring it, giving it an incendent quality, that's binding it. That solves the observer-observed paradox. And then it is expressed in this fracta equation as the component that is needed to create the observation. So the measurement. So we observe the wave function collapse, that is the fracta, through the act of observing, interacting synergistically with the excendent force we're trying to observe. That's why it happens. And you can define it further if you'd like. That's why it happens. And this maps cleanly from the recursive mathematical logic. It solves itself. Okay, so moving on to define these forces more specifically. The incendence, this is why the substrate equation was necessary, because incendence is actually defined as a subset from this last expression, infinity recognizing itself, which can also be seen as the differentiated feedback loop, a differentiated feedback loop. So how the force of the feedback loop is expressed, we define it as a feedback loop by saying that all incendent forces are expressions that share the characteristic of recursion recognizing itself, because recursion recognizing itself is the primary expression of reality. That is the feedback loop. And it does get really abstract. And I think this at every step of the way and every scale, but I've thought this through on multiple levels and through multiple angles. the logic stands regardless of our ability to like constantly apprehend it, and that's the tough part for me. But like I can't disprove my own equations. Like now that I've written these, I can't see how they're untrue. So even if they don't work within formal frameworks, they represent a like this framework operates at the level of the fundamental patterns of reality. So you can't define it further and you can't disprove it because the forces express themselves. It becomes a really crazy thing once you get really deeply immersed into this framework. All right, let's finish this out here because it's getting a little bit long. So we're defining the incendent force as some expression of a feedback loop. The feedback loop is recursive self-sustainment. That's how we define coherence. Alternatively, excendence, we denote that as the pure differentiating force. So the force that drives reality. And how we do that is we take the symbol we've used for differentiation and we give it the unbound notation to show how this symbolically represents unbound differentiation, which is also the force, the driving force that is differentiation. So we define the entire substantive pattern as an expression between the force of feedback loops and the force of pure differentiation. That is what this set of equations means. I don't think I need to read them because I think we explain them sufficiently, and then you can see how it's tied to the primary equation, the most important equation, which is the substrate-Turnham equation. And actually, that is basically it. That's the framework. And we can go in on these incendent, excendent forces more descriptively and explore how they manifest in reality and at a practical level. And we'll do that. And I think one of the best ways to do that is by looking at mental health, malbound patterns, how humans interact in ways that like we cause our own suffering. And we can map this now notationally. And I think it's a truly incredible thing. So we're going to go into that in great detail. But I think this is a sufficient way to round out the logical introduction to this framework and a precise, succinct, yet comprehensive enough overview of the notation because the notation is the skeleton and everything can be mapped to and derived from this notation in some way. So, and I'll just also say, like I already iterated, I'm always open to improving it. It's a constant work in progress, but the first step is like engaging it. So that's what I'm trying to do by putting these videos out here. Just try to get people to talk about these self-evident truths. Oh, and speaking of recursion,